Hey everybody, I am back for another episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Took a couple of weeks off to kind of get a little bit of rest, recoup, get kind of resettled for what will be, has already been a pretty exciting off season. There's plenty to talk about. We're going to get into a lot of what's happened over the last couple of weeks since the last episode. We're also going to talk to my good friend and also writer and NBA draft analyst, Bryant West, and we will go over the potential of the WCC guys who are coming out potentially into the NBA draft and what the outlook for all those guys is. And then also because we're also going to talk a little bit of Warriors Kings. We did record this on Friday, so this is pre-game one. So just a little bit of the caveat there. But I mean, he's a Kings fan. I'm a Warriors fan. So we'll dive into the what could turn into a real rivalry between the two teams. But we got to start with the portal. And obviously that's the main number one thing that most of college basketball is talking about right now. There's 1,400 plus players that have jumped into the portal to this point. We still have a few more that are slipping in and everything else. And the WCC obviously is not immune to this. We already talked about some of the people who had already jumped into the portal a couple weeks ago. And since then, the list has continued to grow and grow and grow. And maybe the most shocking of them all, I mean, yes, we've already talked about Mike Mitchell Jr., we've mentioned Mike Meadows, but maybe the most shocking of them all happened this week, and that was Santa Clara's Carlos Stewart. This one is the one that kind of like I think really hits the league the hardest. Because when you look at what Carlos Stewart did this season, what he potentially could bring next year, I mean, I'm not the only one who looked at it, but because I was talking about it toward the end of the year, going into next season. If Podziemski and Stewart stayed together, they were automatically going to be the best backcourt in the WCC. Like there was no way around that. And not only do we know Podziemski is already declared for the NBA draft, he could return. But now we have the news of Carlos Stewart putting his name into the portal, which is a huge blow to Santa Clara and what I thought their outlook might have been. But then as of Sunday, Herb Sendek works quick. And I don't know, and this was probably in the works with the news of Podziemski, but it did not take long for Santa Clara to maybe find that next guy to step into the role. Keep in mind, if Podziemski says he's likely going to get taken, whether that be in the late first or even in the early second round, I think he'll go. But he'll have had two back-to-back draft picks to the NBA, and maybe what could be the next, maybe not immediate, but another guy who's going to make an immediate impact at Santa Clara. They picked up Arizona transfer Adama Ball. He played 26 games just this past year, is only playing about 8 minutes a game. But one of the things to look at is that he was a pretty efficient 3-point shooter, shooting 35% from the field, 6'7". He's a sophomore, so he's going to have at least a couple more years of eligibility. If that's what he so chooses. Real fast turnaround for Santa Clara to respond to not only Podziemski, but then also to Stewart taking their talents elsewhere. Now, again, we could still see Podziemski come back. We'll see how that all goes. But again, we've mentioned that's not the only team that's kind of been active or who's been impacted. Most everyone has had, actually, I believe everybody has had at least one player hit the portal. One of the other notes, Mike Mitchell Jr., Mike Meadows, I meant to say. Mike Meadows, who transferred out of Portland, didn't go far. He ended up transferring just down the road. He's now at LMU. And LMU has also been pretty active, bringing in Justin Hill from LSU and then Justice Hill from LSU, and Justin Wright from NC Central. They have a lot of pieces coming in. I don't think that the fall off from what they were last year is going to be all that great, if it is at all. A lot, obviously, we know fell on the shoulders of Cam Shelton. He's gone. Justin Arns ran out of eligibility, and then the ones that do hurt: Jalen Anderson hitting the portal, Chance Stevens also hitting the portal. That was one that was not necessarily. I think it was a little surprising, but just it's unfortunate because I was excited to kind of see what he was going to end up being in the WCC and what we could have seen from him down the road. And the other team that's actually been pretty, at least not very active, but because their name is floating around with a lot of prospects right now, is Gonzaga. And we already know that Gonzaga has been pretty well hit by the offseason. We knew Drew Timme was gone. We knew Julian Strother was going to go. He declared for the NBA draft. Hunter Salas, Efton Reed, Rasheer Bolton, and now, and also Dom Harris. And now you can add Malachi Smith's name to that list, not to the portal, but to the NBA draft list. He is a player that could still come back. I think it's going to be really interesting, the decision on that front. I'm in a selfish way, I do hope that Malachi Smith does return. I think that Gonzaga is going to really need him going into next year. This is a team with a lot of turnover, and one of the things that we saw last season is the teams, for the most part, a lot of the teams with continuity did better early and are able to carry that on throughout the season. Gonzaga had a lot of that continuity last year. Even if you lose like an Andrew Nembhard, you still have a Drew Timme and Anton Watson, Strother and whatnot. So it's not like Gonzaga's used to having at least some level of stability or in continuity. This is going to be a very, very different looking Gonzaga team going into next year. But that does not mean that obviously they're devoid of talent or they don't have anything coming in. They have a few really good freshmen who are likely going to play next year. Alex Tui from Australia, Dusty Stromer from one of the better players in California. And then you also have Steele Venters coming in, the Eastern Washington transfer. He averaged over 15 points per game this year. He averaged 16 points a game last year. So this is a guy who's going to be able to bring in an offensive spark for the Zags pretty quickly. This is a guy who's going to have a couple more years of eligibility, so expect him to really kind of be able to start to fill into that one of those roles for Gonzaga. I think for Gonzaga, still the one that we're still waiting for, the one as I'm recording this, hopefully it doesn't change in the meantime, is the decision of Anton Watson. Anton Watson has a number of options. He could return to Gonzaga for one more year. He could enter the portal as a grad transfer, or he could go ahead and take his chances in the NBA and with the NBA draft. I think the only real options are probably him returning or him going to the draft. I think those are the actual only realistic things that are going to happen with Anton Watson. So it's a matter of whether or not what more is to be gained for Anton Watson by staying. And I think I would argue, I don't think there's much else he can prove in college or at Gonzaga of what he can do at the next level. We know what he's capable of defensively. We know what he can. We started to see more and more of what he can do offensively. If he gets a look in the G League or in the summer league, which I think he will, I think he would get a look and see what he's going to have to show more of that offensive game in addition to what we already know and how good he is defensively. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of these guys with Bryant in a little bit. But with all of this talk about this player going here, this player going there, one of the big breaking news items that came out over the last week was news of someone who was staying and coming back. And that was Alex Dukas at St. Mary's. He made the announcement that he would be returning for his 5th year, which I was not expecting. I thought that this was a guy who, along with Logan Johnson and Kyle Bowen, had kind of put in his time. Then it was time to move on. And how much the injury in the UConn game plays a factor into that, that will be an interesting note to kind of see if that was really part of the equation, because I could see how you don't want to end your college career on that note when you know that it could have changed the fortunes of that team in a lot of ways. I mean, if you watch that game beginning to end, that was still the team that, until that injury, played UConn better than anybody else. So his return also, I think, eliminates some of the questions you may have had about St. Mary's going into next year, because you could almost lock in who 1, 2, 4, and 5 are going to be going into next year. I could almost Aiden Mahaney, Augustus Marshallonis at the 1 and the 2. Your center is Mitchell Saxon. Joshua Jefferson was probably going to be sitting there at the 4. But what were you going to do at the 3? There were a lot of options. There's a lot of talent coming in. They only really had 10 active guys on the roster this year, and there's going to be a lot of pieces that are going to rotate in and out next season. But the 3 was still a question mark, and that has absolutely been answered with the return of Alex Dukas. We know what he can bring on the offensive end. We know what he can bring defensively. We started to see more of that aggressiveness offensively toward the end of the season. And for me personally, I've waited for him to be more aggressive on a more regular basis on the offensive end, because he has the skill set. He can start to take over a game if he really wants to. And I think we're going to see more. We're going to see a very different offensive set going into next year too, because again, you remember that this team was what has been such a good defensive team the last few years, largely because of that trio of Dukas, Bowen, and Logan Johnson. Without Logan and Bowen in that rotation, this is going to look very different. Now, I think they're still going to be a very good defensive team, but now this team seems to have maybe more offensive punch to it, and it's going to have to balance it out when you don't have all of the defenders you may have had just in this past season. And I think there's something to be said about, as everyone is scrambling, really almost every WCC team is scrambling to figure out what they're going to do, how they're going to fill out their rosters and everything else. The one team just sitting pretty is St. Mary's. They are the one team in this league who is essentially set going into next year. You might see there might be some movement in the transfer portal. We don't know, but it really does seem that you take a look at this roster, you look at who's coming in. You have Jordan Ross, the top 100 freshman who's going to be added to that backcourt. You look at guys like Rory Hawk, who was already there with this team, and then guys like Andrew McKeever. See what he's going to end up looking like. They are bringing in a number of pieces that are going to probably help out to an extent early on, much like the young kids did this year. But to the point of how everyone is running around trying to fill the roster, St. Mary's is essentially done. And they're set going into next season, which I'm sure if you're the coaching staff in Moraga, it's that is you're really glad you're not having to kind of jump into this rat race and be so reliant upon trying to find talent in the portal. Now, one of the things I was starting to look at it is just who has the most holes outside once the dust has settled, once everything is as far as the portal of like who's out. Not necessarily the who's in yet, but who is out. And man, there are some teams who are really, really going to be struggling. I think to not a struggle, but like it's going to take them a lot to fill the roster. A couple of those teams, I mean, Portland is in a world of hurt. If you look at what Portland has lost this offseason, it's kind of staggering. You lose Jack Perry, you lose Mike Meadows, you lose Moses Wood, you lose Alden Applewhite, you lose Nduka. You lost a lot of pieces that were pretty critical to their puzzle. So we're going to see a very different Portland team next year. Pacific had a couple of late entries into the portal. Kalen Boone and Jordan Ivy Curry hit the portal. So especially Boone, that's a blow for Pacific. He was really starting to come into his own this past season, and that was going to be exciting to kind of see him grow in that program. But that's almost like a reset, and let's see how it goes from there. We already talked a little bit about what USF is bringing in, but this one's the tough one where you lose Shabazz, you lose Roberts, Zane Meeks hit the portal. Like this is going to be a little bit of a rough go, I think, for USF as well, at least like early on. I think a lot of the WCC teams are going to be facing growing pains as far as getting comfortable with each other. We talked a lot about this with San Diego last year. San Diego added a lot of new pieces. We thought it would take them some time before they ever were able to gel because they weren't familiar playing with each other. And I think that's what we're going to see a lot of from most of the WCC teams. I think we're going to see a lot of that from Portland. We're going to see a lot of that from Santa Clara. We're going to see that from USF. We're going to see that I think we're going to see that even to an extent with Gonzaga. Like, even though a lot of the pieces that are returning are familiar with each other, Nolan Hickman coming back, you still have like the likes of Braden Huff. You bring back Ben Gregg. There are pieces on that roster that are familiar with each other, are going to play bigger. We're going to play bigger roles on this team next year, no matter what. But even they, I think, are going to struggle a little bit more than we're used to seeing even a year ago. Because again, even going into last year, you have Drew Timme. You're still kind of like, this potentially could still be a team in the title conversation. They could still make a deep run. Are they still a Final Four team? I don't think you can have that conversation with Gonzaga off the bat right now. Obviously, what happens in the portal could change all of that. But as of right now, looking at the roster, what they do have coming in, this is going to be just a very, very different outlook for what we see for Gonzaga and a lot of the teams in the WCC. I don't know if I want to necessarily say it'll be a down year for the league, but it's going to be a very different year for the league. I think that's the best way to kind of describe what we will probably see from these teams going into the 23-24 year. All right. Well, with the NBA playoffs kicking off and the NBA draft a couple months away, and we're starting to see more guys start to get into it, we're going to switch over. We're going to dive into that conversation with Bryant West, again, NBA draft analyst, and we'll also be talking some Warriors Kings because that, like, he being from the SAC area, me being from the Bay Area, we got to do it. So, all right, again, just a reminder, this was recorded back on Friday afternoon. So here we go. Here's Bryant West. Excited to bring on my good friend Bryant West. He's a writer and NBA draft analyst for the King's Herald. You can find him on Twitter at BSWest5. Bryant, it's always good to talk to you. So the NBA draft obviously is still a couple months away, but there's a lot of movement in the WCC, a lot of guys who either have run out eligibility, guys who've left early, all that sort of stuff. So amongst the WCC players that have jumped into the draft, put in their name, whatnot, who's maybe the most intriguing to you that as a prospect going into the league, not necessarily the best, but who's interesting on that list?
Well, it's interesting because I think the most interesting guy is probably the one who was on the worst team in the WCC the last 2 years, and that would be Max Lewis. Because as you and I have talked about at length, there's a difference between contextualizing a player in college and how he's surrounded and the talent he's got around him and the coach in this case, and how that's going to translate to the next level. Max Lewis, when you watch him, he's both got his time at Pepperdine really showed skills that will make him very intriguing to NBA teams, but also show that what he did at Pepperdine, his role is probably not what he's going to be asked to do, at least very early in his career. Across those first couple of games in non-conference play, he was amazing. Like in 8 games in December, 21.5 points, 4.5 rebounds, a steal per game, almost 50% shooting. But then, as everybody knows, as soon as he got to WCC play, those coaches had watched his non-conference tape, knew what to do to lessen his offensive impact. In those 16 games of conference play, 15.1 points on 41% shooting and 25% from deep. But the potential that he showed early in the year was still there. It was just kind of hidden behind his inconsistencies. And Pepperdine had really figured out, oh yeah, we're not going to be very good this year. Mm-hmm. Big thing for him is his role in the NBA is going to change, and it'll change quickly, as it does for 95% of rookies. Pepperdine let him create a lot with the ball in his hands. Early in his NBA career, I expect he'll be playing as an off-ball catch-and-shoot guy a lot more, which is good because he shot 43% off the catch. And combined with the improvements he showed later in the season at getting to the basket, kind of balancing that on-ball creation, hey, I want to step back, but I probably should get to the rim more. That's a promising 3-level scoring that he's got to continue to develop, but real flashes of on-ball creation. That's an offensive package that teams are going to love in the later first round.
And with just like the continued rule changes and the pace of play and just the style we have in the NBA, is there as much of a concern over maybe a guy's defense and what that could translate into? Because obviously we know like Max Lewis has like the offensive skills. Like we've kind of seen that over the last couple of years. But Pepperdine was also the worst defensive team in the conference. And
last 2 years.
And so is there any concern on that front, or is that just one of the things obviously like these teams are going to weigh?
Oh, they'll absolutely weigh it. And I'm sure that it will knock him down below some guys. Because, if a team's got 2 guys who are even on the scouting report in terms of offense, being on the worst defensive team and not being a great defender in his own right, let's not pretend that Max was just a solid defender hidden on Pepperdine's awful defensive team. He was not good. I definitely think that will weigh in the minds of NBA front office makers, because as much as this league is offensive first, and a lot of my King's Herald friends always tell me defense is for nerds, you got to get guys who can defend at least some level if you're going to be a playoff team come April and May. I don't need to tell you Max's defense was pretty bad last year. He had some moments of patience, poised on-ball defense where he really showed his tools, his length. He could swallow up defenders. And when dudes beat him off the dribble, I'm thinking about that UCLA game in particular. He showed an ability to stick with it and snag recovery blocks. He has the tools to make an impact on defense, but he lost his man off the ball plenty of times, failed to stay locked in the first place. Faster offensive threw him and his whole team into chaos. He's a ways away from being an NBA-level defender, but it all comes back to this. He's a guy who I really hope goes in the latter half of the first round, because if he gets snagged by a playoff team, one that says, hey, go to the G League for a year or two, slow your roll down, you're not going to come in and do the same thing you did at Pepperdine. His potential as a project player 2 years down the line, he could be a really, really poised offensive player and a good defender. I think he's got the tool set for that, but it really, at that point, depends on him finding a better team situation than he had with the Waves.
All right. So when we talk about the most intriguing, who do you think amongst this group of guys is going to be the best pro? Like, who's actually going to be do you think is the best player amongst this group to be in the league? Like, who's going to have the longest career or whatnot? Obviously, I don't think there's a Jalen Williams in this group this year. Like that.
Well, we didn't think that Jalen Williams was that guy last year, did we?
That's true, but I don't see anyone like skyrocketing up the draft or anything like that. So like I could see like there's a couple of guys who could maybe be like really good role guys and maybe a potential starter. So who's maybe is there someone that kind of sticks out to you who's like they're going to be the best long-term NBA player?
I'd still bet on that being Max Lewis, but if I'm not talking about him, I'd probably bet on Julian Strother. It would be a coin flip between him and Podziemski, of course, but I think I'd go Strother just because he's got much better size. I haven't really dove deep into Julian State for this year yet, but man, did he have one hell of a second half of the season, 17 points per game across both January and February. Took a huge step forward this year, proving that deep shot was real. Those first 2 years, I think it was like 26% and 33% last year from deep and 40% this year. And thriving as that catch and shoot weapon next to Timmy. That'll be his role at the next level. Teams will love his combination of size, shooting ability, burst with the ball in his hands, and that big shot against UCLA is going to stick out in teams' minds for sure.
Yeah, the one thing I feel like with Strother, because I agree, I think like he probably has the best opportunity to be like a long-term NBA player because he is so gifted offensively. That floater in the lane is one of the better shots and one of the tougher shots that a lot of people kind of like overlook. But he's also like a pretty good defender. Like, so he's a little bit more of a balanced player in that way. Cause I mean, we saw some of that in the tournament of like, you're not going to put him on like maybe the other team's best defensive player, but he's not going to hurt you defensively. And I think that's one of the things that because of Strother's size, his length, that he's not a detriment on the defensive end.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the most important things that teams look for is the percentage of players at the next level who are great defenders is not very high. The important things for good defensive teams is to have good to solid defensive players at the very least. And Strother, I mean, there were definitely some Gonzaga games where I'm watching and I'm thinking, oh man, he definitely could do better on defense. But then I realized that's because I'm also watching Anton Watson, and that's not a fair comparison because then it's like, okay, this is WCC's best defender this year, and nobody on that Zags team is anywhere close to him defensively. So Strother has to pick it up. He's got to be more consistent on defense, I think. But no team's going to look at him and be like, we can't draft him because he's not a good defender or something. Mm-hmm. I'd bet come June he's a first rounder. Teams love shooters. They love shooters with size. They love shooters who can score at 3 levels. He'll need to improve that defense. He'll need to continue to up his assist numbers. But his role at the next level is crystal clear. He showed it this year. He was Drew Timmy's catch and shoot weapon. At the very least, teams are going to be like, okay, we know what you're going to do early in the career, and we'll figure the rest out as we go. And
he's a guy that can come up in the clutch and is not going to shy away from those moments, as we've seen multiple times.
By the way, I don't know if I've talked to you about this. When he took that shot, I could not believe that they were okay with him taking that shot. Because it was, even in the moment, it was like, this is a set play. This isn't just him deciding to take this. And then, of course, all of the post-game conference made it very clear, oh, yeah, this was the play they were doing. I still can't believe that not only did he have the onions to take that, but that Few was like, oh, yeah, just do that far away.
Hey, if he could do it in Provo, he can do it in Vegas.
I know, but I still can't believe that was the best, that was the play that they'd call, which just shows Mark Few's trust in every one of his players who gets to that level with him. It's incredible.
Yeah, that was an amazing shot. I mean, that game was nuts. I mean, just that the back and forth of that one. I mean, I thought it was a wrap once Gonzaga was down by a dozen, and then once UCLA was down by 10. I was like, that game was. I mean, it was amazing to watch it, and it kind of like not like irks you, but it's like I'm almost bothered by how good Gonzaga UCLA games are. And just,
oh yeah, for sure. That was probably the best game of the tournament that I can think I saw. But then it didn't matter because then Gonzaga lost to UConn by more than St. Mary's did.
Well, almost everybody lost to UConn by more than St. Mary's did.
Yeah, no, everybody did in the tournament. I think.
We lost by 14. Miami only lost by 13, although that game was not as close in feel as ours was, at least for the longest time. Yeah. St. Mary's hung around for a lot longer than Miami did. Miami was down big early and had to catch up. But all that aside, so I'm thinking about just looking at the rest of this potential draft class, and there are a couple, and you mentioned his name a little earlier. I'm kind of curious because we don't know what his decision yet. He may come back about Anton Watson, because this is a guy who we know how good of a defender he is. The all-league defender. Obviously, many Zag fans would have made the case he was the defensive player of the year, not Logan Johnson.
He should have been. I love Logan. Let's be real. Anton Watson should have been the defensive player of the year.
Best defensive team. Like, come on. Like, all right, we can go back and forth on that, on the argument over Anton. But
I love Logan Johnson.
I'm thinking about just like the prospect that Anton Watson is the next level, because what we also got to see toward the end of the year was the tools that he had offensively. We started to see a little bit more of what he could do, because that just wasn't his role. He wasn't asked to do a lot on the offensive end. And when we did get to see it, you clearly saw that he had those tools. He can be a stretch guy potentially. So what's the potential outlook for a guy like Watson? Is it worth it for him to make the jump now? Should he go back to Spokane? What's your kind of read on what Watson is?
Well, I'm glad that the rules are set up that guys like Watson can get as much feedback from NBA teams as possible before making this decision, because if you made me bet right now if he gets drafted, and nowadays getting drafted isn't the end all because guys will get two-way contracts and that's as good as being selected. I would bet that he isn't one of the top 60 guys, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a role at the NBA level. He absolutely needs to prove what he can do on offensive level. Now, is that easier to prove in being in somebody's G League program next year, or is that easier to prove being in Gonzaga for another year? I don't know. I can't tell you that, but he absolutely needs to figure out his offensive role. He needs to either be a corner shooter, figure out some way to threaten defenses when the ball is in his hands, because he won't earn an NBA spot if defenders can just ignore him. But he was the best defender in the WCC this year for a reason. He handled a massive range of defensive assignments, was the biggest reason for their mid-season defensive turnaround. I'd love to see him figure it out at the next level, because GMs love guys who can stick with smaller guards, rebound the ball, and do something on offense. He seems to me like a less rim protecty version of Brandon Clark, in terms of teams are going to love smart defenders like that. He just needs to prove that he's got some way to make defenses stick with him.
Mm-hmm. So another guy who has the option to come back, decide what he wants to do, is Brandon Pajemski. And he's an interesting case because we see what he can do offensively and really the playmaker that he is, because he has really good vision. He's a good passer. The defense is the one thing maybe you can kind of look at is he an NBA level defender? Is he going to be able to create at his size at the next level? So to me, it's a little bit of back and forth, but what's kind of your impression of where Pajemski is and what kind of like the thought pattern is for what he could be?
Yeah, I think he's going to be an eye of the beholder kind of draft pick. I'm very confident he'll have a role in the NBA for a long, long time, whether it's this year or next year. And I kind of just on how breakout candidates like this tend to work, I would say, unless teams say there's no way you're getting drafted, go back. I think he comes in this year. I think he gets a 2-way contract. Dudes with his shooting ability, touch within the 3-point line, ability to hit those gorgeous runners off the bounce, his physicality on both ends, even if that doesn't always translate to success on defense, that just speaks to a dude who will carve out a role in the NBA. The league wants shooters. He's more than just a shooter. Give him a role in a motion offense. Let him run around, shoot off dribble handoffs, keep the ball moving as a secondary initiator. That's a bench guard at the very least. The two criticisms I've seen, one is very obvious. He could not handle smaller guards, which is a downside because I don't honestly think I know Santa Clara listed him as 6'5". I don't think he's 6'5". I bet when the combine comes and goes, he's going to be under that. His range is going to shrink. His defensive range will shrink significantly at the NBA. I think he'll need to try to bulk up and guard up lineups, not down. But if you need any proof of his physicality and toughness, look no further than the fact that he led the conference in rebounds. Like in a conference with Drew Timme, Mitchell Saxton, Anton Watson, a guard led in boards. Yeah. It's always cool to see a guard who can box out with that. The other criticism I've seen is that for how much of the heart and soul and initiator of that offense he was, his on-ball creation that he showed at Santa Clara isn't translatable to the next level. They let him do so much with the ball in his hands. So much of the time his eventual buckets kind of relied on him. Long stretches of probing the defense, resetting, getting the ball back out, trying again. But like I kind of said with Max, is he steps back to much less of an on-ball role at the next level. Like he's going to be able to catch and shoot. He's going to be able to threaten off of handoffs. I firmly believe he can thrive as an off-ball first guard who can surprise guys in a pick and roll. But his tape at Santa Clara shows a guy who can hit a lot of tough shots, one that I think will be a lot harder for coaches to justify him taking in the NBA. So I can't say if I'd take him with first-round pick yet. I have plenty of tape to watch between now and then, but my gut says he's a guy I'd want on a guaranteed contract. Shooting is at a premium in the league, and he's the best, one of the best shooters in this class, and on offense, he's more than just
that. It's really exciting to be able to kind of hear about it's not just one guy. A lot of times WCC classes, just the one guy we end up talking about. In the last few years, it's there's at least 4, 5, 6 guys that we were these are NBA players. These guys are going to play at the next level. It's exciting to just kind of see just the depth, because we're not just talking about Gonzaga players. It's got got one from Santa Clara, one at Pepperdine. We can talk about, obviously I don't think St. Mary's had one this past year. We'll see, who knows, what happens once people get the
2 years. 2 years we'll be talking about one St. Mary's guy in particular.
That's we'll probably be talking about Mr. Mahaney by that stage.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that's happening as we are recording this, it's Friday, and one of the first things, as both me growing up the Warrior fan, Bryant growing up the Kings fan, we have Warriors and Kings for the first time in the NBA playoffs. The series starts up in Sacramento at the Golden One Center on Saturday. Bryant, you and I were talking off camera just a little bit about this series. I know it's the first playoff series for the Kings in a long, long time. How excited are you? And just and talk about a little bit about this matchup and the fact that you're going to have to root for a Zag to do well for you to win.
Well, let's take a step back and acknowledge that the Sacramento Kings are the Kings of the WCC guys. Head coach Mike Brown, who is now a Saint in Sacramento, former San Diego guy. Assistant head coach Doug Christie, and now Kessler Edwards, who came over from Brooklyn in midseason trade and is now one of their better defenders off the bench from Pepperdine. Matthew Dellavedova I've heard from multiple people how much his impact off that bench. De'Aaron Fox absolutely loves him. He's doing a great job in that locker room. St. Mary's grad, patron saint of St. Mary's basketball. I kind of feel like there's somebody else from WCC I'm forgetting. I don't know. Must not be important if I'm not thinking of his name. No, of course. This team last year when they made the trade for Domas Sabonis, like, he has fit in so well with De'Aaron Fox. His physicality down low, and yet his ability to run the offense through him in the high post just makes the right decisions every day. League leader in rebounds. Absolutely needs to be on an all-NBA list. It will be a crime if he's not. This team turned around because of that trade. As for this series, I'm of three separate minds. The first is that, as many of my buds over at the Kings Herald blog keep saying, this season for the Kings is playing with house money. They didn't just break the playoff drought by sneaking in through the play-in tournament. They did so by being third in the West for multiple months, showed huge steps forwards as a team that won't go away no matter what happens this postseason. So whatever happens in this series or beyond this season was a success. The second mind here is the Kings are really good. Their offense has been amazingly consistent all year long. They've won more road games than anybody in the Western Conference. Flip side of the Warriors, I might add. I don't think the Warriors have any real answers for stopping De'Aaron Fox or Sabonis. This Kings team isn't a fluke team. Mike Brown, who, by the way, probably knows the Warriors better than any non-Steve Kerr coach in the league, has had these guys ready to play all season long. I'm positive he'll have them prepared for the Dubs. And Kings faithful are right to point out, like, Sacramento's been better than Golden State all season long. We can talk about pedigree, we can talk about experience, we can talk about being here. We're just talking about the teams as they've played to this point, Kings have been better. If you just showed the stats for this series, no names on the back of the jersey, just the team stats, I think the sentiment around this series would be that the Kings are a better team. But Nerf gun to my head, I predicted the Dubs are going to win this series. Steph,
I think it's such an interesting series because you're right. It's like the Kings have been better all year long, but when you look at the team that they have to go up against, it's almost like it would be different if they played anybody else. If they had the Lakers or the Clippers, or if it had been Minnesota or whomever else. But the fact that it's the defending champs with this pedigree, and this is the one thing I think, like, a lot of that, it's playing out very similar to the end of last year, where all the Warriors care about is that everyone is available come playoff time. Yeah. And everyone is available come playoff time. Wiggins is expected to be back for game one. Gary Payton II, I think, was a huge addition.
Yeah, thank goodness they got him back. He is he's by far my favorite Warrior as a non-Warriors fan to watch. I love that guy.
And the fact that you're kind of like getting into a little bit of a rhythm, and as much as I hate the idea that, a team can flip the switch or whatever else, it almost kind of looks like that's exactly what they've done in the last 2 weeks, is that the Warriors have flipped the switch, and it's like, okay, playoff time to go. And they look like a different team than they did a month ago. And I think it's going to be exciting. The way I have looked at this series is that for this to go the Kings' way, they have to get game one. Mm-hmm. If they get game one at Golden One, I think this is a 6-7 game series. If the Warriors go up and take game one and take the crowd out of it, I don't know. It feels like this could be a steamroll by the Warriors if they are able to go up there and get game one and just remove the crowd from it. Now, I've had Warrior fans talk to me about the idea of the crowd, of like, Warrior fans are going to take over the building, blah, blah, blah. Pause. I'm sorry. Have all of you forgotten what Arco Arena looked like in those playoff years back in the early 2000s? That is one of the loudest, craziest, most raucous crowds in the NBA when they get going. Yeah. And that's the thing. I was like, do not underestimate what Sacramento will bring crowd-wise in games 1 and 2. Like, do not disrespect the Kings fans like that.
I appreciate that you have the long-standing basketball history to remember what the Kings were in their heydays, and importantly, how this fan base surrounded them in their heydays, because there are so many people out there who are just thinking that Golden One Center is going to be filled with yellow and blue. No, Kings fans are absolutely going to rock that building. But like you said, this Kings team knows what the Warriors are going to do in game one. They're going to come out and they're going to try to punch this Kings team in the mouth. And the Kings will either be ready for it, and I expect they will because Mike Brown would not have it any other way, or they won't, and this will be and we'll have our answer for how this series will go pretty early. I bet this goes 6 or 7 games. I think this will be competitive. The Kings offense is just too good. Nobody has been able to slow them down at all this season. I would, if Nerf gun to my head, I'm picking the Warriors, but mainly because this was just the last team I wanted to see the Kings play in the first round. I was trying to figure out every possible way. Now, bring me those injured Clippers. Bring me the Fakers. The Lakers team, I know that they had that late season defensive turnaround. I absolutely would have bet on the Kings in a 7-game series against the Lakers. I would have bet on a 7-game series for the Kings with Minnesota. I would have bet on a 7-game series for the Kings with pretty much everybody else 5 or lower in the playoff seedings. Warriors were my nightmare matchup. So, but like I said, a loss will not diminish my love for this Kings season. They're headed in a good direction. This franchise has finally turned it around.
It's exciting to see the Kings be good again. It was exciting when the Kings were good in the early 2000s, and if they can be good and the Warriors can be good at the same time, it can become a real rivalry with both these teams are actually pointed in the right direction. All right, Bryant, thanks for hopping on. Thanks for spending some time to chat some NBA draft, some Warriors and Kings. I just have to leave this with go Dubs as we go into the next couple weeks. Thanks again for hopping on, and we'll be chatting down the road.
Of course, bud. Anytime.
So one of the things Bryant mentioned in that conversation was the amount of impact that WCC programs are having on the NBA, and more specifically with the Kings. Obviously, like he'd mentioned, Mike Brown, you have Kessler Edwards, Dellavedova, Sabonis. Like there's a lot of Doug Christie. There's a lot of influence on that roster that have ties back to the WCC. And the NBA more and more and more, it's like you look around, like players WCC alums are having good impacts on these playoffs. Obviously, we can talk about Eric Spoelstra, the Portland alum, and we can continue on just like the incredible career he's had on the coaching front. He gets game 1 as an 8 seed against Milwaukee. Yes, they didn't have Giannis, but still going into Milwaukee, getting that is a huge game. And just on Sunday, we also saw a 20 spot from Rui Hachimura off the bench. Like you're seeing WCC guys make significant impacts in games that matter and in situations that matter and are influencing the league in a lot of different ways. And again, we could talk about Jalen Williams and what he was able to do all this season for Oklahoma City. You can talk about the year, even though he didn't really get a great chance, Jamari Bouye and what he was able to do in the G League for most of this season. And actually, hey, a little bit of a blast from the past, a guy who really also hasn't gotten his NBA shot, but Jared Brownridge won a G League championship. And so you can kind of look up and down just the number of teams, the number of guys who have come from a WCC school who is making an impact in the league. And it really is incredible. So kind of going back to the conversation we did have earlier, as far as like, yes, like there's a number of guys, probably more guys that are NBA level talents in this league than ever before. And then also that's why I like the portal and the way it has impacted the WCC this year is going to be very interesting, because it's now essentially there's evidence that shows you can be an NBA player out of this league and be a successful NBA player out of this league. And how much of an impact that has we'll see, because we know it exists. We know it's there. There's now evidence. There's plenty of evidence. And we can just go down the list of all the current NBA guys. But the playoffs are going to be exciting to see what all the WCC alums are able to do and what sort of impact they all have. The draft in a couple of months, we'll see who stays, who goes. I think the most interesting case is Malachi Smith. I think there's I think that there's any benefit for him to stay? I think the answer is no. I don't know if there's anything left for him to gain by staying in college. And I think he'd get a look in the summer league. I think he'd get a look in the G League. I think he can work in his way into a 2-way contract and be able to get into the league that way. Do I think he gets drafted? No, I don't think that happens. But I do think that there's something to be said about what his chances are. All that said, it's going to be really interesting to see where the rest of the portal falls, how these teams start to rebuild, and some of these teams still have a lot of rebuilding to do. I don't want to sugarcoat that at all. Some of these cupboards look bare right now. So it's going to be a very, very challenging summer for a lot of the WCC coaches to fill these rosters. Obviously, there's plenty of players out there, and the big schools can't take them all. So there's going to be guys who fall to the WCC programs, and I think there's plenty for these WCC teams to offer these players. I don't think that you're not hurting yourself by going to a WCC program, and we now see the evidence in the league. All right. Well, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Follow me on Twitter at Post by Zach on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and then also be sure to like the podcast, share the podcast, subscribe on YouTube, all those good things. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'm going to start working on the schedule and what that all looks like for the rest of the summer. If you have suggestions on who you'd like to hear on the podcast, let me know. DM me, tweet at me, send me messages, whichever way you can. It'd be great to have some other ideas as well. So again, I will be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. Until then, have a great next couple of weeks, and I'll catch you next time.